The desert night carried a silence so heavy it felt alive, broken only by the faint rustle of dry mesquite branches and the cry of a far-off coyote. A thin crescent moon hung low, its pale glow painting silver edges across the endless sea of sand and rock. On this lonely stretch of New Mexico territory, a figure moved slowly, each step marked by weariness. She was an Apache woman, her braided hair unkempt, her deerskin dress torn at the hem, and her feet blistered from miles of walking barefoot over rough ground. Every muscle ached, but it was not only exhaustion that weighed her down. It was the memory of all she had lost. Her village had been scattered months ago, her people driven into the mountains or across the border by soldiers and raiders alike. She had survived by stealth, by hiding in arroyos and sleeping in caves, by trading what little she had for scraps of food in distant towns where suspicious eyes followed her every move. But now the desert had worn her thin. Her body craved rest, warmth, and shelter. More than that, her spirit craved safety, something she had not known since the day her world had been torn apart. As she trudged up a faint wagon trail, a dim shape rose in the distance, a house. At first, she thought it a trick of her tired eyes, some ghostly mirage shimmering against the horizon. But no, as she drew closer, she could make out the solid outline of a ranch, a wide porch, shuttered windows, and the soft orange glow of a lantern burning inside. The smell of smoke drifted faintly on the night air, promising fire and food. For a moment she froze. To approach a white man's home was dangerous. Doors had been slammed in her face before. Words like savage and thief had been hurled at her, sometimes worse. There was always the chance she would be turned away or shot before she even reached the porch. Yet her legs carried her forward anyway, driven by desperation stronger than fear. She whispered a silent prayer to the spirits of her ancestors. Just one night, one roof above my head, one chance to live another day. When she reached the steps, she hesitated again, her hand trembling as she reached for the wooden railing. The boards creaked under her weight. From inside, the muffled sound of boots shifted across the floor, and her heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of running, melting back into the shadows of the desert, but her body was too weak and her hope too thin. She forced herself to stand tall, though she swayed from exhaustion, and knocked softly on the door. The sound seemed to echo louder than she intended. For a long moment there was nothing, only silence stretching taut as a drawn bowstring. Then a voice, deep and cautious, called from within, "Who's there?" She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and answered in halting English, "I need roof for tonight." The words came out barely above a whisper, yet they carried all the weight of her journey. She wasn't asking for kindness, not daring to. She asked for the smallest thing, a roof, one night of shelter. Behind the door, the rancher hesitated. She could hear the metallic rasp of a rifle being lifted, the creak of a floorboard as he moved closer. The lantern light grew brighter through the thin crack in the wood. Her pulse pounded as she stood waiting, her breath visible in the cold desert air. If he turned her away, she had nowhere else to go. If he raised his weapon, she had no strength to run. All she had left was that whispered plea. One night, one roof. And on the other side of the door, a choice was about to be made that would change both of their lives forever. Inside the modest ranch house, Daniel McGraw tightened his grip on the Winchester rifle resting against the wall. He had lived too long on the frontier not to be cautious. Strangers knocking after dark rarely brought good news. Bandits, drifters, claim jumpers, they all had a way of showing up when a man least expected it. He moved toward the door, his boots scraping against the wooden floor, and pressed his ear to the panel. The voice he had heard was faint, broken by weariness. A woman's voice. He frowned. That was rarer still. in his 10 years carving out this ranch from the wildland. The only women who'd passed through were saloon girls brought by cowhands or settlers' wives clinging to wagons bound for California. A lone woman asking for shelter was out of place and out of time. Daniel thought of ignoring the knock, letting the night swallow the voice. It would be easy. Just stay silent, and she would move on. He owed her nothing. He had worked too hard to build this life, to keep his cattle safe, to protect what little remained after the fever had taken his wife. He didn't need trouble. And this woman, Apache by the sound of her accent, was nothing if not trouble. Still, something held him back from turning away. Maybe it was the way her words had carried not demand, but desperation. I need roof for tonight. Not food, not money, not favor. Just a roof. Just a chance to rest. The rifle still in hand, Daniel drew the bolt and unlocked the door. Slowly, cautiously, he pulled it open a crack. The lantern light spilled onto the porch, illuminating the woman standing there. She was thinner than she should have been. Her cheeks hollowed from hunger, her eyes dark pools that reflected the flame. Her dress was torn, her braids frayed by wind and dust, but she stood with a kind of stubborn dignity. Her chin lifted, though her shoulders sagged from exhaustion. For a long moment, the two stared at each other in silence, the weary wanderer and the solitary rancher. The only sound was the night wind, whistling across the open desert. Daniel's instincts warred within him. He could shut the door and bar it. She would move on, and the burden would not be his. He could also invite her in, and open himself to whatever danger she carried. There were men in town who would spit at the sight of an Apache on white land. Soldiers who would ride out at the mere rumor, and raiders, too, who might come looking for her. Why here? He asked finally, his voice rough from disuse. Her lips trembled as she searched for words. Light, she whispered, nodding faintly toward the lantern. House, safe, safe. Daniel nearly laughed at the word. His ranch was barely that for himself. Yet the way she said it, half hopeful, half pleading, struck something in him he hadn't felt in years. He thought of his wife, Sarah, who used to take in strays, injured birds, abandoned calves, even a wounded coyote once. She had always said a person's worth was measured by how they treated the helpless. Daniel lowered the rifle, though he kept it close at hand. He studied the woman one last time, weighing the choice in his mind. He could shut her out and live with the image of her face burned into his memory, or he could open his door and see where fate led. Finally, with a sigh, he stepped back and swung the door wider. Come in, he said. The words felt heavy, final, as though they bound him to a road he hadn't planned to walk. The woman's shoulders sagged in relief, and for a heartbeat her eyes softened. She crossed the threshold silently, like a shadow slipping into the light. As Daniel closed the door against the desert night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just invited more than a stranger into his home. He had invited change, and change, he knew, never came without a price. The door closed with a dull thud, muting the howl of the desert wind outside. Inside, the air was warmer, tinged with the scent of burning mesquite logs and fresh bread cooling on the hearth. The woman stood just inside the threshold, motionless, as if unsure whether she truly belonged there. Her eyes darted quickly across the single-room cabin, walls lined with rough-hewn shelves, a wooden table scarred by years of use, a bed in the corner covered by a quilt faded from sun and time. It was plain, but to her it might as well have been a fortress. Daniel kept his distance, rifle still in hand, though his grip had loosened. Sit, he said, nodding toward the chair nearest the fire. His tone was brusque, more command than invitation. but the woman obeyed without hesitation. She lowered herself onto the chair, her back stiff, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He noticed the way her fingers trembled, not just from cold, but from exhaustion that reached down to her bones. She was too thin, he thought, starved near to breaking. A month of steady meals might put strength back into her limbs, but she didn't look like she had a month left in her. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice quieter this time. Her eyes flickered up to his, uncertain. She hesitated, then gave the faintest nod. Daniel moved to the hearth and cut a thick slice of bread from the loaf cooling on the mantel. He added a slab of venison from a pot simmering over the fire and placed both on a wooden plate. He slid it across the table toward her. "Eat." The woman's gaze lingered on the food as if she didn't quite believe it was hers. Then, slowly, carefully, she reached out. She ate with small, measured bites, not the desperate gulps of a starving animal, but the cautious restraint of someone who had learned never to waste, never to take more than was given. Daniel watched in silence, though he found himself strangely moved by the sight. When she finished, she lowered her head and murmured something soft and Apache, too quiet for him to catch. He guessed it was thanks. "What's your name?" he asked after a pause. She looked up at him, eyes guarded. "Nietzsche," she said at last, the word rolling softly from her lips. Daniel nodded. "Daniel McGraw." They sat in silence for a while, the fire snapping in the hearth, the desert wind rattling against the shutters. Nietzsche's gaze drifted to the window, as if expecting to see shadows waiting beyond the glass. He noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her body never seemed to fully rest, as though she were ready to spring at the slightest noise. "You're safe here," Daniel said finally, surprising even himself with the words. Her eyes flickered, toward him again, searching his face for truth. Safe was not a word she trusted easily. Perhaps not at all. Yet something in his steady gaze seemed to soften her expression, if only by a fraction. He set his rifle aside, leaning it against the wall, and pulled out another chair to sit across from her. The space between them was filled with questions. Neither dared ask. Who had driven her to his door? What dangers might follow? And why, after years of keeping to himself, had he let her in at all? But for tonight, those questions could wait. Tonight, she would have bread, fire, and a roof above her head. And for reasons Daniel could not yet explain, he felt certain he had done the right thing, even if it meant trouble would come. As the flames crackled low and the night deepened, Nietzsche's eyelids grew heavy. She leaned slightly toward the fire, her chin dipping against her chest, sleep pulling at her at last. Daniel rose quietly, fetched an extra blanket from the bed, and draped it gently over her shoulders. For the first time in years, the cabin did not feel empty. The desert dawn arrived, pale and slow, its first rays filtering through the gaps in the shutters. Daniel rose early, as he always did, the habits of ranch life too deeply carved into his bones to break. He moved quietly around the cabin, feeding the fire and pouring water from the clay jug into a tin basin. He expected his guest to still be asleep. Most folks would be after the exhaustion he had seen on her face the night before. But Nietzsche was awake. She sat near the hearth, her blanket pulled close, her dark eyes following him with a wariness that had not faded with rest. Sleep had touched her, yes. There was a faint softness around her eyes, but it had not loosened the weight she carried. Even in stillness, she seemed like a hunted creature, always listening, always measuring the distance to the door. Daniel broke the silence with a practical offer. "There's water for washing. Bread if you're hungry." She nodded once and rose gracefully, though her movements were stiff from weariness. She washed her hands, then broke off a small piece of bread, eating slowly. Daniel sat at the table with his own plate, the silence between them stretching long and taut. He had lived alone for years, accustomed to quiet, but this silence felt different, crowded with unspoken questions. At last he set down his cup. "You said last night you needed a roof, just for tonight. Where were you headed?" Nietzsche's fingers stilled over the bread. She lowered her gaze, her voice soft. "No place." Daniel leaned back, studying her. "Everyone's headed somewhere." Her jaw tightened, but she did not look up. Instead, she spoke slowly, as if each word had to be chosen with care. "Soldiers came. My people. Scattered. Some north, some across border." She drew a shallow breath. "Some not alive." Daniel's stomach tightened. He had heard the stories. Raids, villages burned, families driven into the mountains like game to be hunted. The papers called it progress. He had never thought much on it. Out here, a man had enough to worry about with his own land. But now, sitting across from this woman with grief carved into her face, he could no longer shove those stories aside. Her voice faltered, but she went on, her English halting. "I ran, many nights, hide in rocks, caves, find little food, men chase." Her hand curled tightly around the bread, though she did not eat it. "Always chase." Daniel felt something twist inside him. He knew the look in her eyes. He had seen it in his own mirror after Sarah died. A look of someone who carried ghosts wherever they walked. "You made it farther than most would," he said finally. "That counts for something." Nietzsche's eyes lifted to his for the briefest moment, then dropped again. "No, I only live." The words cut him, not in their despair, but in their simple honesty. She had survived, yes, but survival was not the same as living. He knew that truth too well. After Sarah, he had done the same, kept the ranch running, tended the stock, endured the seasons. But he had not truly lived, not until a stranger knocked at his door last night. They sat in silence for a while, the fire popping softly in the hearth. Daniel wanted to ask more, but he sensed her limits. Too much spoken at once might shatter what little trust she had offered. So he let the matter rest, though her words lingered in his mind. Outside, the first light of morning spilled across the land, painting the desert gold. Daniel pushed back from the table and reached for his hat. "Chores won't wait. You're welcome to stay by the fire." To his surprise, Nietzsche rose as well. "I help," she said firmly, as if daring him to refuse. Daniel studied her, noting the thinness of her frame, the tired set of her shoulders. Yet there was steel in her eyes. She had survived this long not by hiding alone, but by fighting. And though part of him wanted to tell her to rest, another part, an older, lonelier part, found himself strangely grateful for the offer. "All right," he said at last, "but it won't be easy work." Nietzsche gave the faintest nod, as though easy had never been a word in her world. And with that, shadows of the past began to loosen their grip. Not gone, but shifting, as the first fragile threads of trust began to weave between them. The morning sun rose over the mesa, spilling its light across Daniel's spread. The land stretched wide and stubborn, rough but beautiful. Mesquite trees scattered like watchmen, scrub brush clinging to red earth, and cattle grazing in the distance. To most it looked barren, but to Daniel it was everything. Every fence post he had dug, every acre he had fought to keep, had been carved out with his own 2 hands. Nietzsche followed him through the yard, her steps steady though her body carried weariness like a shadow. She took in the corral, the barn, with its sagging roof, the chickens pecking in the dirt. She studied it all with a quiet intensity, as though memorizing the way this little world worked. Daniel saddled a horse with practiced ease, the leather creaking under his hands. He glanced at her, then jerked his chin toward the water trough. "You can start there, fill it from the well. Cattle will be thirsty come midday." She nodded without hesitation, moving to the well and setting to work. Her movements were deliberate, her frame thin but wiry, revealing the strength of someone used to surviving harsh land. She hauled the bucket, poured it into the trough, and repeated the task without complaint. Daniel found himself watching her more than he cared to admit. Most women he'd known, settlers' wives or town ladies, would have balked at hard labor. But Nietzsche worked with quiet determination, her face calm despite the strain. It stirred something in him. Though he pushed the thought aside, when the chores slowed, he leaned against the fence, arms folded across his chest. "You've lived through hell to come this far," he said at last. "But life out here, it doesn't get easier, even for me." Nietzsche tilted her head, listening. He looked out over the land, his jaw tightening. "Sarah, my wife, she kept this place alive when I couldn't. Cooked, mended, saw to the sick calves. And when fever took her—" His voice caught, and he cleared his throat, forcing the words through. "This ranch near broke me. Thought about selling it, letting the desert swallow the boards and posts. But it's all I've got left of her." "So I stayed." Nietzsche's gaze softened, her dark eyes reflecting something he hadn't expected. Understanding. She didn't speak, but he felt her silence like a hand laid gently on his grief. Daniel went on, the words spilling easier now. "Some nights I sit on that porch and wonder what the fight's worth. Cattle get rustled, fences rot, storms wipe, out whole herds. And I'm just one man trying to hold it together." He let out a slow breath. "Some days, it feels like I'm only surviving." At that, Nietzsche's lips curved, just faintly, into the ghost of a smile. "Same," she said softly. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither looked away. They were two souls cut from different worlds, yet bound by the same burden, living each day not out of hope, but out of duty to what had been lost. The moment broke, when the wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of dust from the south. Daniel straightened, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. Nothing stirred yet, but his gut tightened. Trouble had a way of finding men who couldn't afford it. He turned back to Nietzsche. "You've got strength. I'll give you that. But if you stay here, if you even stay one more night, you need to know this place comes with more weight than just fences and cattle." Nietzsche studied him, her face calm but resolute. "Burden shared," she said, the words broken but clear. Daniel blinked, caught off guard by her answer. He wasn't sure if she understood the full measure of what she was saying, but part of him wanted to believe she did. For the first time in years, he didn't feel quite so alone under the wide, unyielding sky. The days stretched into a quiet rhythm neither Daniel nor Nietzsche had expected. What began as a single night of shelter turned into 2, then 3, until a week had slipped past. Daniel told himself he was only letting her stay until she regained her strength, but each morning when he stepped outside and saw her already working, hauling water, gathering eggs, mending torn feed sacks, he found fewer reasons to ask her to leave. Nietzsche was not idle. Though her frame was thin and her movements still stiff with weariness, she worked alongside him as if she had always belonged on a ranch. She carried buckets from the well, her steps steady. She scattered feed for the chickens, her soft voice, murmuring to them in her own tongue. She even took a needle and patched Daniel's worn shirt, her stitches neat and precise. At first, Daniel resisted the help. "You don't owe me work," he muttered when she offered to mend the fence. "This isn't your burden." Nietzsche only looked at him, her dark eyes steady. "I stay," she said simply. "I help." Something in the plainness of her words unsettled him. She was not asking permission, she was declaring her choice. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Daniel didn't argue further. Each evening they shared the same table. Daniel, who had grown used to eating in silence, found himself speaking more than he expected. He told her about the land, about how the seasons shaped the cattle herds, how storms could wipe out a year's work in a single night. He spoke of Sarah, too, Though sparingly, the memories still tender. Nietzsche listened quietly, rarely interrupting. When she did speak, her words were brief, her English limited. But sometimes she switched into Apache, her voice low and musical, as if she were speaking to herself or to spirits unseen. Daniel couldn't understand the language, yet something in its cadence steadied him. Like the murmur of water through a dry arroyo. Trust was slow in forming, but it came in small ways. One morning, when Daniel's horse reared at a rattlesnake, in the brush, Nietzsche darted forward and killed the snake with a swift strike of a shovel before he could react. Another night, when a coyote prowled near the chicken coop, Daniel found her already outside, bow in hand, standing guard beneath the moonlight. She carried her past like armor, and that strength began to settle into the ranch itself. Yet Daniel knew the dangers. The world beyond his fences would not look kindly on an Apache woman under his roof. Neighbors already gossiped when he rode into town alone. What would they say if they knew? Soldiers from the fort patrolled the territory, their eyes sharp, for strays who had escaped their campaigns. To harbor her was to invite trouble. One evening, as the fire burned low, Daniel spoke the warning aloud. If folks find out you're here, it won't sit well, you understand? Some will want you gone. Others— He hesitated, his jaw tightening. Others would do worse. Nietzsche's gaze did not falter. I know, she said softly. Then, after a pause, she added, You want me gone too? The question hit him harder than he expected. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her posture, the way her presence filled the cabin that had once been unbearably empty, and realized he could not give the answer he thought he would. No, he admitted, his voice rough. I don't. For the first time, Nietzsche's lips curved into a true smile, small but unguarded, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. It was then Daniel understood that trust wasn't built in grand gestures, but in these small, fragile moments, moments where a burden became a bond, and two solitary lives began to weave into one. Daniel first sensed it in town, a week after Nietzsche had settled into his home. He had ridden in for supplies, flour, salt, a new coil of rope, and found the general store quieter than usual when he stepped through the door. The clerk greeted him with forced cheer, but the two men playing cards near the stove stopped mid-hand, their eyes narrowing. Daniel felt the weight of their stares as he moved through the aisles. When he returned to the counter, the clerk leaned in, his voice dropping. Dan, he muttered, folks been talking. Some say they seen tracks out your way, smaller feet than yours. Ain't the kind of tracks a man leaves. Daniel's jaw tightened. He said nothing, only counted out his coins and gathered his goods. But the whispers followed him as he stepped back onto the street. A woman drawing water from the trough glanced sharply at him, then at the bundle in his arms as if measuring what kind of home he kept. Even the blacksmith gave him a curt nod, not his usual easy grin. By the time Daniel mounted his horse, the knot in his gut had hardened. Word was spreading faster than he had expected. Back at the ranch, Nietzsche was splitting kindling when he rode up. She straightened at once, scanning his face with those sharp, watchful eyes that always seemed to read more than he said aloud. Trouble? She asked, simply. Daniel dismounted, brushing dust from his hat. Not yet, he said. But folks are starting to notice. That night, as they sat by the fire, he explained. Out here, people don't forget the wars. They don't forgive easy either. Some lost kin. Some just need someone to hate. You being here, it'll stir things up. Nietzsche's gaze flickered to the flames, her expression unreadable. I go, she said quietly. No bring trouble. The words hit Daniel like a fist to the chest. He should have agreed, should have told her it was for the best, for her safety as much as his. But the thought of the cabin without her presence, The silence, the emptiness returning, was something he couldn't bear. "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. "You're not running again. Not from this. You've run enough." For a moment, they sat in silence, the fire popping between them. Then Nietzsche nodded once, as if sealing an unspoken pact. The days that followed were edged with unease. Riders passed along the distant ridge more often than before. Dust clouds rose, on the horizon only to vanish again. A neighbor, one Daniel had known for years, came by on the pretense of borrowing a tool, but lingered too long, his eyes scanning the yard as if searching for something or someone hidden. And then there were the signs no neighbor left. A dead rabbit nailed to the fence post one morning, its blood dried black in the sun. A coil of barbed wire cut and left dangling, as though someone had tested the ranch's defenses. Daniel's hand hovered closer to his rifle, his eyes sharper on the horizon. One evening, as twilight painted the desert purple, Nietzsche stood on the porch beside him, her bow strung and resting against her shoulder. She said nothing, but her presence told him she understood what loomed ahead. Daniel's voice was low, steady. "They're coming. Not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but they're coming." Nietzsche turned her gaze to him, her face calm, resolute. "Then we stand," she said. And though fear prickled at the edges of his thoughts, Daniel felt a strange steadiness settle over him. For the first time in years, he was not standing alone. The air grew heavier in the days that followed, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Each sound carried sharper, hoofbeats echoing on the ridge, the cry of hawks overhead, even the creak of the barn doors in the wind. Daniel felt it in his bones. Trouble wasn't far off now. He and Nietzsche worked harder, but with a different urgency than before. Daniel checked the rifle stock and oiled the barrel each night, the metallic click of the lever echoing through the cabin. Nietzsche strung her bow, testing the strength of her arrows, her hands steady as if she had been born for this moment. Together they set traps near the chicken coop, reinforced the barn doors, and stacked spare firewood close to the porch, where it could serve as cover. It wasn't much, just a rancher's patchwork defense against whatever men might come, but it was something. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Daniel and Nietzsche stood at the corral, watching the cattle shift nervously. Dust clouds stirred in the far distance. Not close enough to see riders, but close enough to promise them. Daniel's jaw tightened. "They'll be here soon. Maybe neighbors. Maybe raiders. Maybe both." Nietzsche's gaze was steady. "You send me away now," she said softly. "You fight alone." He turned to her, shaking his head. "I don't want you in harm's way. You think I not know danger?" Her voice carried sharpness, but beneath it something deeper, something unbreakable. "All my life is danger. Run, hide, fight. Same always. But here—" She gestured toward the land, the corral, the cabin behind them. "Here is different. Here I choose." Her words struck him harder than he expected. Daniel had spent years enduring the land because he felt he had no choice, duty to his wife's memory, to the blood and sweat he had poured into the soil. But Nietzsche spoke of choice, of staying not because she must, but because she wanted to. "You could still leave," he said, his voice rough. "Slip away in the night. No one would know." Nietzsche stepped closer, her eyes locking on his. "And leave you? Alone?" She shook her head. "No, we stand. Together." The silence stretched between them, heavy with meaning. For the first time since Sarah's death, Daniel felt the walls he had built inside himself begin to shift, to crack. He realized that Nietzsche wasn't just another soul seeking shelter. She had become part of this place, woven into its rhythm, into his life. He reached out slowly, almost uncertain, and touched her hand where it rested on the corral rail. Her fingers tightened around his without hesitation. The gesture was simple, yet it carried the weight of a vow. "We'll stand," he said at last, his voice steady. "Side by side." That night, they prepared in silence, but it was not the silence of strangers. Daniel carried buckets of water into the cabin, lining them against the wall in case of fire. Naiche stacked arrows within easy reach of the door, her movements precise. When the lantern was lit and the fire set low, they sat at the table facing each other. No words were needed. The choice had been made. Outside, comma. The desert night stretched wide and dark, filled with unseen eyes and distant hoofbeats. But within, the walls of the little cabin, there was something stronger than fear, something neither of them had expected to find, a shared resolve. The attack came just before dawn. Daniel had been half awake, listening to the restless moan of the wind through the shutters when the sound of hooves thundered across the hardpan. His eyes snapped open. No rider came this early unless he meant, "Trouble!" "Up," he said, his voice low but sharp. Naiche was already rising from her blanket near the hearth, bow in hand, her movements quick and soundless. She crossed to the window and pulled the shutter open a sliver. The glow of torches flickered against the dark horizon. Half a dozen riders, maybe more, their shouts carrying on the wind. Daniel's stomach tightened. Damn. He grabbed the Winchester, checked the chamber, and moved to the doorway. "They mean to burn us out." Naiche's eyes narrowed. "Then we not let them close." The riders spread wide as they approached, whooping and hollering to rattle nerves, but Daniel stood steady on the porch, rifle raised. The first shot cracked across the valley, sharp and sure. A torch tumbled from one rider's hand, smothered, in the dirt before it reached the barn. The man wheeled his horse and bolted, cursing. Naiche loosed an arrow a heartbeat later, the shaft whistling through the air to strike another rider's arm. He yelped, dropping his reins and his horse, carried him off in a wild circle. The rest pressed harder, spurred by anger and pride. Bullets tore splinters from the porch post, one grazing the edge of Daniel's hat. He ducked low, fired back, and saw a rider pitch sideways into the dust. "Barn!" Naiche shouted, her voice sharp. Two riders had broken away, galloping straight, for the livestock. If the barn went up, the ranch was lost. Daniel cursed, firing at one while Naiche sprinted across the yard, moving swift and low. She loosed two more arrows in quick succession, driving the men back. One torch landed smoldering against the barn door, but she was on it in an instant, stamping it out with her boot before it caught. Daniel's heart lurched as he saw a shadow. Moving behind her, a raider raising a pistol. He fired, the crack echoing across the valley, and the man fell hard, his gun skittering into the dirt. Naiche didn't falter, only raised her bow again, her face set with fierce resolve. The fight raged on, smoke and dust filling the air, the smell of gunpowder mixing with mesquite. Daniel's rifle barrel grew hot in his hands, but he didn't stop. Every time he thought the line would break, Naiche was there. Her arrows swift, her presence unshaken. They moved as though they had fought together all their lives, each guarding the other's blind spots, each trusting the other without hesitation. At last, the remaining riders faltered. One shouted for retreat, and within moments the band scattered, spurring their horses hard into the desert. Torches lay guttered in the dirt, the barn still standing, the cattle restless but alive. Silence fell, broken only by Daniel's ragged breathing and the crackle of a dying torch. His rifle shook slightly in his hands, not from weakness, but from the surge of adrenaline finally leaving his veins. Naiche stood across the yard, bow lowered, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. She turned to him, her face streaked with dust and sweat, and their eyes met across the smoke-stained air. No words passed between them. None were needed. They had stood side by side, and together they had held. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, washing the desert in muted gold. Smoke still hung low in the yard, the bitter tang of gunpowder clinging to the air. The ranch bore scars from the night's fight. Splintered boards, a shattered window pane, hoofprints gouged deep into the earth, but it still stood. And so did they. Daniel leaned against the porch post, rifle at his side, his body aching with fatigue. He watched as Nietzsche moved through the yard, calm and deliberate, checking the barn, soothing the cattle, stamping out the last embers of a torch. Despite the battle, there was no panic in her, only the quiet strength of someone who had faced storms far greater than this. When she returned to the porch, her eyes met his, steady and unreadable. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was different now. Not tense, not cautious, but full. Heavy with all they had endured together. Daniel broke it first. His voice was low, roughened by smoke and exhaustion. "You were ready to leave once. Said you didn't want to bring me trouble." He looked out across the land where the desert stretched vast and unbroken. "Well, trouble's found us anyway." Nietzsche tilted her head, watching him. "You want me gone now?" The question cut straight to the bone. Daniel turned toward her fully, his weathered face shadowed by the rising sun. He thought of Sarah, of the years of silence that had hollowed him out. He thought of the nights he'd sat alone on this very porch, wondering what it all was worth. And then he thought of Nietzsche, arriving at his door with nothing but exhaustion and a whispered plea for shelter, and how, in the days since, she had filled the emptiness with something he hadn't thought possible again. "No," he said at last, his voice steady. "Not now, not ever." Nietzsche studied him, as if searching for the truth in his words. Slowly, she stepped closer, her hand brushing the worn wood of the porch rail. Her eyes softened, though her voice was still quiet. "I asked for roof one night. You give me more." Daniel's throat tightened. "You asked for a roof," he said, his gaze holding hers. "I'm offering a home, for as long as you'll have it." The words hung in the air, simple and unadorned, but they carried the weight of a vow. Nietzsche's lips curved into a faint smile, one that reached her eyes. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and strong against his calloused palm. In that moment, the burden of years seemed to ease. The ranch still faced storms, neighbors' suspicion, and the harshness of the land. But Daniel no longer faced them alone. And Nietzsche, for the first time since her people had been scattered, no longer walked as a shadow. Together they stood on the porch as the sun climbed higher, casting long light across the valley. The desert was wide and merciless, but in its heart, two souls had found refuge, not just for a night, but for forever.